We always think of North Africa as a desert, though there's so much evidence to the contrary that proves that not only was it not a desert, but it was connected to the rest of Africa, and that animals that were in North Africa migrated further south, deep into Africa, following the water and following the nature. This too would have happened for the people living in North Africa, given that it happened in Egypt and in Nubia. Following the water and following the greenery, they find their ways deep in southern Sudan and in Sudan. The rock art clearly shows things that are common in sub Saharan Africa. But as this is not sub Saharan Africa, these should be called Saharan African ancient relics. And as you can see with these paintings, that some of them depict African hair, African bodies, these spots that resemble tattoos or scarring. This depiction of a giraffe in Tasselnagir in Algeria speaks volumes, and it's very surprising to see a giraffe in this area given this map that shows where giraffe are found today. They're not exactly the most abundantly spread animal, and for them to make a home in North Africa to the level where people could depict them almost perfectly tells you how safe they felt in this region. But of course, since the planet shifts and the seasonal, at least we could call it cosmically seasonal, shift happens, the greening of the Sahara disappears, and so do the wild animals. From 7000 BC, we see something very strange depictions of people swimming. These depictions in the cave have now been called the Cave of Swimmers. And this is more than conclusive evidence that there must have been a lot of water, as we don't really see that many depictions of people swimming in history, period. So to find it here in a desert is very interesting, especially beautifully depicted. We even see animals drinking from the river. Interestingly, all these depictions are depicted as dark skin, and you can see that the children are depicted slightly lighter, and they too have these dots and these stripes on their arm, and also the dots that depict their hair, showing that their hair is very curly. This is no coincidence. This is clearly a depiction of real skin color, showing that their skin darkened with age. There is one image I know about that depicts a white person sitting in the middle around blacker people. And I have to say that this is probably a spiritual thing, given that he's sitting right in the middle and he looks very comfortable with the rest of the tribe. Notice how he doesn't look foreign or doesn't feel foreign to the rest of the tribe. We see more depictions of animals, and interestingly, we see horses and people riding chariots that almost resemble the ones from Egypt, the ones which are two wheels and a single chariot holder. Interestingly, it looks like there's a woman driving the chariot. Given this long introduction, it's probably time we have to go into the similarities between Africa and North Africa. And of course, we can start with these ancient depictions that show similarities between Africa and North Africa. Another similarity between these areas and the rest of Africa is the Afroasiatic languages. So, in other words, the Berber languages, whether it's Tamashek, Gabel, or any other language from North Africa, ancient Egyptian, they are part of the Afroasiatic group, meaning that they originate in Africa and spread throughout the African continent, mainly towards East Africa, North Africa, West Africa, that entire region that we know was not Khoisan has Afroasiatic. And with the spread of Afroasiatic speakers, it eventually made its way throughout the entire continent. But it's very interesting that it spread throughout the entire continent. Its similarities with Bantu languages is a debated topic. And in fact, I was going to watch a debate yesterday that was supposed to happen between a two scholars. That was Bantu versus Sumerian, if there's any similarities. But at the last minute, the one of the debaters pulled out. But even though this is a frontier thing, I still have to point it out because the similarities to me seem so there. They seem so obvious. And anyone that I've pointed it out to who speaks some of Bantu languages, their jaw drops.
Takbaylis, Tamashek,
يون
Ian,
سين
Shin,
كراض
Karat,
كوز
Koz,
سموس
Smos,
صديس
Sadis,
صا
Sa,
طام
Tam,
تزا
Taza,
مراو
Maraw,
سيدي ربي يحمل يمدان الدنيا مرة أرميد يفكا ميسا وحيد إواكن كرا نوين راه من النيس وريت متساثرة معنا أذ يسعو تدرت دايم
خلاص مسين غجاي الدنيا ترها تارق فاليكفار رسوانيا يرسرس ومن دق وريمت.
Like previous videos, I emphasize the art styles that are repetitive from one to the other. For example, the music, the dance, the visual art, and the storytelling. What we are about to watch or listen to is from the British Museum, and it will depict and debunk two ideas that have been made up in this world. The first idea is that Berbers never mixed with Saharan or sub-Saharan Africans, and the second one is that Africans never used the wheel. So let's just get straight to the reading. Chariots in the Sahara. A number of sites from this collection are located in the Libyan desert, notably the Fezzan region, and include paintings of chariots in a variety of forms, dating to the horse period from up to 3,000 years ago. This has stimulated some interesting questions about the use of chariots in what appears to be such a seemingly inappropriate environment for a wheeled vehicle, as well as the nature of representation. Why were chariots used in the desert, and why were they represented in such different ways? And as you can see here, there it is in a cave, showing someone driving a chariot with some animal, probably a cow or a horse. The chariot has been one of the great empowering innovations of history. It likely originated in Mesopotamia about 3000 BC due to advances in metallurgy during the Bronze Age, and has served as a primary means of transport until quite recently. In the historical period across Africa, Eurasia, and Europe, chariots provided rapid and efficient transport and were ideal for the battlefield, as the design provided a raised firing platform for archers. As a result, the chariot became the principal war machine. from the Egyptians through to the Romans and the Chinese, who owned an army of 10,000 chariots. Indeed, our use of the word car is derived of the Latin word carus, meaning a chariot of war or of triumph. And you can see their Sumerian version of it, or Akkadian, okay, Neo-Assyrian. The chariot in the Sahara was probably introduced by the Garamantes, a cultural group thought to be descended from Berbers and Saharan pastoralists. Now, I want you to keep that in mind, that what they're saying, from Berbers and Saharan pastoralists, meaning that the Saharan pastoralists are not Berbers. They're something else. This is going to be very important when we read other texts about the Garamantes. There is little textual information about the Garamantes. Documentation comes mainly from the Greek and Roman sources. Herodotus described them as a very great nation. Recent archaeological research has shown that the Garamantes established about 8 major towns as well as numerous other settlements, and were brilliant farmers, resourceful engineers, and enterprising merchants. The success of the Garamantes was based on their subterranean water extraction system, a network of underground tunnels allowing the Garamantian culture to flourish in an increasingly arid environment, resulting in population expansion, urbanization, and conquest. And you can see here another chariot with Africans basically ritualizing a so-called flying gallop chariot. Now, you can see here that they're trying to give the impression that these people don't know what they're doing, and that these chariots are probably from hearsay. But let's first carry on reading. On average, there are about 500 drawings of chariots across the Sahara, from the Fezzan in Libya through the Air of Niger into northern Mali, and then westwards to the Atlantic coast. But not all were produced by the Garamantes. It is still not certain that the chariots were driven along the routes where their depiction occurs. Remains of chariots have never been found west of the Fezzan. However, the Fezzan states were thriving trade routes, and chariots are likely to have been used to transport salt, cloth, beads, and metal goods in exchange for gold, ivory, and slaves. The widespread occurrence of chariot imagery on Saharan rock outcrop has led to the proposition of chariot routes linking North and West Africa. Let's pause there for a second. Because you see the chariot imagery in West Africa on cave art from 3,000 years ago, and you see the same thing in North Africa, it shows that these two places were linked. Now, I want you to keep that in mind. It's going to be important when we talk about the words that they used in North Africa and West Africa. However, these vehicles were not suited for long distance transport across desert terrain. More localized use is probable, conducted through middlemen who were aware of the trade routes through the desert landscape. Additionally, the horse at the time was a prestige animal, and it is unlikely that they facilitated transport across the Sahara trade routes, with travelers rather utilizing donkeys or oxen. And you can see here, there's a chariot with a donkey on it, or not a donkey, a cow, because you can see it's got horns. Very faint, but you can see them. The absence of archaeological evidence for chariots has led to the suggestion that some representation of chariots may have been the result of cultural diffusion transmitted orally by nomadic peoples traversing the region. Artists may never have actually seen the vehicles themselves. Now, before we carry on, I want us to go back up and look at these chariots. Does this look like something that you would have heard about? this looks quite clear that this person knows what he's doing. But some people, they have a need to dismiss things. Okay, so artists may never have actually seen the vehicles themselves in this case, and if this is the case, chariot symbols may have acquired some special meaning above their function as modes of transport. It may also explain why some representations of chariots do not seem to conform to more conventional styles of representation and account for the different ways in which they were depicted. These two images above depict chariots as if flattened out, with the horses represented back to back. Now, the funny part here is this is just a 2D image, but everything seems to line up with chariots. They're using this as an example of people who never saw the horse. And you can see it's in Libya, the same place where you see this, which means these people are very aware of what they're doing or talking about. Another one, possible chariots, another one. Two images may or may not depict chariots. The rectangular shapes are potentially abstracted from forms of the chariots similar to the flattened out depictions. Discussions previously, these potential abstracted representations often sit alongside distinguished figures, such as geometric bitriangular figures, spears or lances, women wearing long dresses, and animals drawn in a fairly naturalistic style of the horse period when the chariots were being used. Besides the schematic and simply depicted chariots, there is also a group which has been termed the flying gallop chariots. Their distributions includes the whole Tassel region, although there are fewer in the Caucasus Mountains. They resemble the classical two-wheeled antique chariots generally drawn by two horses, but sometimes three or even four. The driver is usually alone and is depicted in a style with a stick head. The majority are shown at full speed with the driver holding a whip, standing on a small platform, sometimes straining forward. And here it is, flying gallop. In a similar manner, it is the schematic chariots. The flying gallop depictions display the entire platform and both wheels of the chariot. In addition, more than one horse is depicted as a single horse in profile, with numerous legs indicating multiple horses, an artistic technique first seen during the Upper Paleolithic in Europe. Interestingly, in the Libyan rock art of the Caucasus Mountains, it seemed that animals could be conceived of in profile and in movement, but chariots were conceived of differently and are represented in plain view, seen from above, or in three-quarter perspective. So, before we go deeper into this, let's first consider what we've read. 3,000 years ago, which is 2000 BC, there were wheels as far as West Africa. And secondly, wait a minute, isn't West Africa 2000 BC when farming started in West Africa? Coincidence? I don't know. But what I will say is that not only do we see this, but we see a fusion between Berbers and Saharans. And yes, black people lived in the Sahara Desert. In the desert, just there. All you need is water if you're black to live in the desert. And they still live in the desert today, the Sahara Desert. As we read earlier,
the Garamantes are responsible for the chariots. So who exactly are the Garamantes? Well, if we read Ptolemy in the 2nd century, he says, at the outset, when writing of the journey of the Garama to Ethiopia, he says that Septimus Flaccus, having set out from Libya with his army, came to the land of the Ethiopians from the land of Garamantes in the space of 3 months by journeying continuously southward. He says furthermore that Julius Maternus, setting out from Leptis Magna and Garama with the king of the Garamantes, who was beginning an expedition against the Ethiopians by bearing continuously southward, came within 4 months to Agasimbia, the country of the Ethiopians, where the rhinoceros is to be found. Each of these statements on the face of it is incredible. First, because the Ethiopians are not so far distant from the Garamantes as to require a 3 month journey, seeing that the Garamantes are themselves, for the most part, Ethiopians and have the same king. Secondly, because it is ridiculous to think that the king should march through regions subject to him only in a southerly direction, when the inhabitants of those regions are scattered widely east and west. Now, I want you to put that in your pipe and smoke it, because if we look at this, it's not just claiming that the Garamantes, for the most part, which means some part of it is not Ethiopian. It's not just claiming that the Garamantes are Ethiopians. It's also claiming that the Garamantes own parts of Ethiopia itself, and it's also claiming that the Garamantes are so large that they span east and west, another claim which is backed up by Herodotus. Herodotus says that the Garamantes are a very large nation. So we're talking about an Ethiopian tribe here that used chariots, and according to the British Museum and now they go all the way down south to the Ethiopian regions. And we're talking here, when we say Ethiopia, because it says Agasimbia, we're talking about West Africa. Now, to get a broader view, we have to look at another person, which the person we're going to look at now is Strabo, and he writes, okay, he says, above the coastline, which extends from Carthage to Cathale and to the land of Mycelians, lies the land of the Libo-Phoenicians, which extends to the mountainous country of the Gaetulians, where Libya begins. The land above the Gaetulians is that of the Garamantes, which lies parallel to the former, and is the land whence the Carthaginian stones are brought. The Garamantes are said to be distant from the Ethiopians, who live on the ocean a 9 or 10 days' journey, and from Amun 15 between the Gaetulians and or seaboard. So, judging by maps of the Garamanti territory, we are talking about a really, really large region. We're talking about from the regions of Egypt, as you can see here, it says Lepis Magna, which is what was described, and you see Garamanti starts over there, and they talk about it going all the way through, and you can see in this map they put the Garamantes in the Sahara, and of course you can see that the Garamanti spread all the way to West Africa. So that's why they say it's huge. And if you check the number, like the Berbers, which are described, if you see how small their territories would be compared to the Garamantes, you're talking about just the tippity tip of the world. And even if you look at the Roman provinces, they're not that big. A common stereotype from the time of the Golden Age of Islam was the credibility or the abilities of black Africans and music. As you saw with Al Jahiz, he documents how musicians who are black African are renowned throughout the world. Even other scholars who wrote about music never left out black Africa. But there's one black African musician who stands out, and his name is Zerib or Zayrib, and he performed all the way from Spain to Iraq and even China. Though he was world famous for his music, he also took part in chemistry. He was a jack of all trades and a scholar. He also did fashion, he also did plannings, and he also did poetry. One of the ways that we know that he existed, since none of his books are left over, is from the historian Jabir ibn Hayyan. Jabir ibn Hayyan actually documents several black people, but this one that he documents, he says that his name was the Blackbird, and he was called this because of his movement across the nations and the fact that he was extremely dark in complexion. Zayrib was one of the most famous people at the time, but he was not the only black scholar who would move around and finance themselves by performing music, which some Arabs had the stereotype that black Africans were natural towards music and that they would be able to sing any song on the first time of hearing it. As we read, celebrated male singers also made the move to Muslim Spain, most notably the famous performer and teacher Ziryab, probably a freed slave of African or mixed African Arab origins, no proof for slavery. His name translates as Blackbird, who served at the court of Harun al-Rashid in Baghdad. Ziryab was forced to leave Baghdad, possibly because he had surpassed his mentor in musical skill, and in 822 moved to Cordoba, where he served as court entertainer for Abd al-Rahman II. No one played a larger role in shaping the musical culture of musical Spain than this black slave from Baghdad. Ziryab set up a musical school in Cordoba, and others in Seville, Granada, Valencia, and Toledo followed his examples. His repertoire was said to encompass 10,000 songs, but his innovations extended beyond music. Accounts tell of Zaryab's inventing formulas for deodorants and toothpaste, serving as an advocate for asparagus, and establishing various hairstyles. He is also credited with the introduction of chess into Europe, but even in this case, the renowned man had strong musical ties to female performers. His two daughters were also esteemed musicians. His student included his slave girl Meta. The story is told of Zaryab teaching his best songs to Meta, who performed them for Abd al-Rahman II. The Sultan grew enamored with the young lady, but hesitated to act on his passion out of the consideration of Zayrib. But Meta took matters into her own hands. She expressed her longing in her songs and chided the emir for his silence. When Zayrib learned of this, he released Meta from his service and presented her to the patron. Afterwards, she resided permanently at the palace. It's important to understand how lots of black Muslim scholars went to Al-Andalus, Spain, and remained there. And not only just the Moors, but people who came as far away as Sudan, as Egypt, as we will see. There's another guy called Al-Misri. Then we will also see other scholars from Iraq and stuff like that, because over and over again, black scholars traveled throughout the entire nations. Now, here's how they got into this position. There's two ways. One, there were always black people in the Middle East. That was one way that they did it, and they were trained like anybody else. And Arabs weren't as racist as we'd like to think. There was racism. The people who deny it, I don't want to play with those guys, but there was racism. But there were also black Arabs who just lived in the Middle East, and some of them were pre-Islam. right? So they didn't just come when Islam came. And then there's the second, which was black slaves who were taken from Sudan and all these other places. But unlike the American slave trade, these slaves would be set free after they converted to Islam. So, in other words, who's capturing these people? Who's bringing them to the places like Iraq, Yemen, Syria, Persia, all these places? Well, the people bringing them there are people who can afford them. And then once they release them, they don't just throw them into the wild. They raise them because those are their kids that they had with these usually slave women. We know that this time the number of women who were carried off outnumbered the number of men who were carried off because clearly they wanted to fill their harems with black women and then they'd have mixed kids with them. This, by the way, went on until very late into, well, very early into the 1900s. There's even a video I've seen where they take black people underground and they bring them to the Middle East as a highly wanted commodity. And when these people get released, they get taught and then they become scholars in their own right and they travel throughout the Middle East as black scholars. And there's hundreds of them. And the reason is because they were some of the most well trained. There's two notable groups that you can say are scholars, and those are black scholars in the Golden Age and Persian scholars. Those are the two biggest ones that you can see make direct contributions as Muslims and as Arabs. Other groups would make contributions, but they tended to make them as outsiders of these two regions. I've done this before, but we have to do it again. But I want you to pay attention to the skills of North African and East African, West African dancers, now that you know that the musical abilities of Africans were well thought of, and even the dancing abilities, I want you to look at this type of meme. It's in Upper Egypt. This is very important because so many incredible people from ancient Egypt come from this location. But not only that, so many people from the Middle Ages of Egypt and the Golden Age of Islam came from this very location. In the Golden Age of Islam, a lot of the people who came from this location happened to be Nubian. The assumption then made is that most people who came from this location in the past would have been Nubian. But here's the weird thing. People like Queen Tai, Tutankhamun, and all these other people, their ancestors descend from Akhmim. Possibly, they could have been Nubian for that reason alone. But if we ignore this for 1 second and think about the most important person to come out of that region, it has to be Dhu'l Nun al-Misri. Not because of what he said about Islam, which he profoundly changed it, introducing some very important steps into Sufism, but more than that was his works on deciphering the ancient Egyptian language, being so knowledgeable about the language himself. His last name, al-Misri, means the Egyptian. And of course, you would expect someone with that name to have done some of the most important research in the job. Before we go too deep with anything about these people, let us look at their faces and see these scars and the way they're made with these double scars and triple scars, which, by the way, have a very deep significance and a deep meaning. And they go far and wide into the continent, and to be found in this place of Egypt, we can easily assume, because we find other Nubian type scarred things from ancient Egypt, we can easily assume that a lot of people who must have come from Upper Egypt or Meme would have had these scars on their faces as well. But why are people who are being found in Egypt having the same scars that you would find in, let's give one example, West Africa? This did give away to show the similarities between these several cultures that were separated at birth, shows you that there is a significantly large and an important part of scarification. Remember, this is scarification of women, and those scars are not light. That is not tattooing. That would hurt. Take a knife, just a small one, and touch the end of it. And I mean one that is sharp, touch the end of it. And now imagine someone doing that to your face, which, by the way, most of these were not done with knives. They were done with like thorns. So this is not a small thing. This is huge. And you can see at the ends of a lot of sticks, or a lot of, I forgot what they call those, shillelaghs. They have these images, these faces that show scarification from the Kingdom of Congo. So we know that the Bantus just did this all over, but I know from seeing it with my own eyes that people in Southern Africa do this too. I've seen it especially with Zulu people. While this has some religious significance or some religious meaning, more than that, it was also used as a medicine. I'm sure you've heard of the word bad blood. Well, this comes from the African tradition of cutting, where you cut the skin in order to let the bad blood out. This was first seen in Egypt a long time ago, but when people got to all kinds of places in Africa, they realized that people, a way that they used to treat something was to cut their skin to let out the so-called bad blood. A second way was to throw up, right, emetics, and then they, get rid of the phlegm. Another one was to basically get any of the bad fluids out of your body. These would be called by a specific name in Europe, which we don't need to go into. I've told this several times, but this is why they share this, and this is why I believe that the ancient Egyptians, we can see that some of them definitely did do it, but this is why I believe that the ancient Egyptians did this anyway, because it's part of their medical system. Some of these things I have to repeat because of what other people have said. So let's first read this. Egyptians were among the first to perform bloodletting more than 3,000 years ago. From there, the practice spread to the Greeks, the Romans, then Asia and beyond. By the Middle Ages, bloodletting was widely practiced in Europe, and barbers served as pseudo medical providers. Now, that's fine. But the context I want to put in here is that I've shown you that Egypt is thought to have interacted with the rest of Africa, whatever what they call sub-Saharan Africa, very little, and that even places like East Africa or Nubia interacted with the rest of Africa very little. And so the question is, given that some of the earliest people to encounter sub-Saharan Africans speak of bloodletting, speak of, let's just go with bloodletting, where did they get it from? If they didn't get it from the Egyptians, where did they get it from? Now, I showed you last time the medical practice of, the one where they seal the female genitals, and other Africans do that too. Circumcision, male circumcision, other Africans do that too. Like almost all the medical practices, or the, let's say, what they would consider preventative medical practices done by the ancient Egyptians are done in Africa, even though the Africans almost hold nothing else that is similar to the Egyptians. Their medical practices are the same. Now, obviously, this has to do with the fact that they stem from the exact same location, somewhere in Central Eastern Africa, and spread throughout. So this practice must be very, very, very old for it to have remained at least within these Africans until, I mean, honestly, people still do it today, still do bloodletting today in Africa. Now that we've got that background about the type of people that the Nubians that lived in Egypt were, let's go into Dhu'l Nun. So the Egyptian and Nubian Muslim Dhu'l Nun traveled as an ascetic in Arabia, Palestine, and Syria. Different aspects of his career are reflected in the sources, a factor which has caused some uncertainty. Different dates are also supplied at some stage. Presumably, when he was still young, Dhu'l Nun moved to Al Fustat, situated near the Nile Delta, far to the north of Akhmim. This geographical democrata is associated with two different roles: a Hermetic alchemist at Akhmim and a Sufi Gnostic at Fustat. Dhu'l Nun twice became a heretic, the dates being variously given. One version states that he was arrested on a charge of heresy in 829 CE. This is too early for other assessments. Following the accession of the Abbasid Caliph al-Wathiq, that monarch gave the order for a Qazi in Egypt to impose stern restriction upon all descendants from the official Abbasid doctrine concerning the Quran. Many scholars in Egypt were imprisoned or fled into hiding, wishing to avoid flogging or execution. Dhu'l Nun himself fled from the persecution. However, he returned afterwards, being now willing to acknowledge official dogma. The compromising report is not found in any of the orthodox Sufi sources which dominate the traditional history of Sufism.
Immediately realize that there was a connection between the Coptic spoken in their days and the ancient Egyptian language, thus calling the ancient Egyptian one Al-Qibtiyya Al-Ula, the first Coptic, and calling the Coptic of their days Al-Qibtiyya Al-Thaniya. And this is in fact the greatest breakthrough that here in the West they used to help them unlock the secrets of hieroglyphic. A famous scholar called Kircher in the 17th century wrote the first Coptic grammar, and it opened the eyes of the Western scholars to the value of studying Coptic in order to understand ancient Egyptian hieroglyphic. How did Kircher, by the way, come to this conclusion? He studied about 40 different Arabic manuscripts. Is somebody you will never believe, Jabir ibn Hayyan. We all know him as a great alchemist, whose theories were, named after him, etc., etc. And from early 8th century, Jabir ibn Hayyan wrote a good book called Hal al-Rumuz wa Mafatih al-Kunuz. Well, as it happened, most of the alchemists I came across who deciphered Egyptian hieroglyphic are also called Sufi. So they are the two things together. Dhu'l Nun al-Masri was a famous Sufi and as well an alchemist. The famous Ibn Wahshiyya is called al-Sufi as well, even though he's primarily an alchemist. All of them. Now, the first major breakthrough, other than the book of Jabir ibn Hayyan, came at the hands of Dhu'l Nun al-Misri, who in the middle of the 9th century was famous in Egypt. He was born in Akhmim, that city in Upper Egypt, brought up there, probably from Sudanese descent, and he spent all his life inside the temple learning the language of the walls of the temple, i.e. hieroglyphic. He must have found a way of linking this because he was fluent in Coptic. He was good at Coptic, that means he was able to read Greek, if not fluent in Greek as well. If you are fluent in Coptic and the Greek in the 9th century, and you live inside an Egyptian temple, and you are fortunate enough to have somebody around you from the Coptic priesthood community, the Rohban, you would be very lucky. You would be in the right place at the right time, because that is one little step to learning this ancient Egyptian wisdom, not necessarily through the hieroglyphic, but remember, a great deal of ancient Egyptian material were translated into Coptic and into Greek. Now, I have a feeling that Dhu'l Nun is the bridge between the ancient Egyptian Sufi tradition and the Islamic Sufi tradition. As you all know him, he is credited that he brought to Islam something that never existed in it before. How did Dhu'l Nun al-Misri come across this? This is the very same science. I, as an Egyptologist, and every Egyptologist here, and one of my excellent friends, Professor Stephen Quirk, sitting there, we all agree that we studied ancient Egyptian texts, unfortunately, for their philological value. If we studied them for its spiritual and religious value, we may have reached this conclusion. The few texts I studied led me to believe that Dhu'l Nun al-Misri came across this science, or the seeds of it at least, through his knowledge of ancient Egyptian religious text. So Dhu'l Nun al-Misri is really the key link between ancient Egypt and Islamic Sufism. But in my case, I'm more interested in him because of his famous book, which Al-Furqan referred to first. And this book is in this one here. This is in Turkey, in Kemal Ataturk Library. And when I found this reference in Al-Furqan, famous encyclopedia on the survey of the manuscript in the Islamic world, I was intrigued. I said, this is very weird. I've never come across in reference to a book like this on the Dhu'l Nun al-Misri. Look at the title. The title is quite remarkable. The title, most of the titles, of course, are very romantic of these. And it talks about the uncovering, al-kashf al-rumuz, uncovering of the signs of the ancient scripts. And they feel, why would a Sufi like Dhu'l Nun be interested in uncovering and deciphering ancient scripts? Anyway, I sent to the library, and they kindly sent me a copy of the whole book. And this is some of the book. Gives the first one, Qalam Jabir ibn Hayyan fi ilm al-Sana, a pen of Jabir ibn Hayyan in alchemy. Alchemy is called in Arabic al-Sana or al-Sana al-Karima, the noble art or craft. Now, any Egyptologist here can recognize in both the top and the lower one so many of the demotic letters. So obviously, this is not Jabir's work. This was credited to him in recognition of his contribution to the field, so they named these demotic letters after him. Now, from the same book of Dhu'l Nun, to the left is his work on Coptic. Now, as I said earlier, he must have known Coptic very well, and he realized also its relationship to ancient Egyptian. So to his left, his own Coptic. He gives the shape of the letters, and he gives the phonetic value of the letters. Compare this to the right from one of our modern books. The arrangement is correct. The phonetic value is correct. It's a fantastic work.
These are the Phoenician letters. They were extinct by the time of Dhu'l Nun and most of the Arabs. But you can see there that you can still see their similarities. So starting from the side, this side, you can see that A is sideways. That's A. That thing that looks like 9 is B. The finger is Gimel. That would be C. The triangle is D. You see with delta. You've seen that in Greek. The E that's facing the other side is E. And I think it also became F. And then it goes on and on and on. Another one that's very notable is this M looking thing. This thing that looks like a W, but it's like curved. That's M. And a lot of these eventually would become the letters that we associate today with the English letters. But you can see them that they look very much alike the normal letters that we have today. But this was just one part of what he added into the religion and took from back in the day, the stages of rising in Sufism. He took that from the ancient Egyptians. He took a lot of their mysticism. I mean, he was a alchemist, and he did all of these other ritualistic things. He probably knew more than he led on about the ancient Egyptians. Not to mention that his name, Al-Misri, means the Egyptian, and that had to do with some deeper thing. There was someone called Al-Iraqi, and he married a local woman, and he became Al-Misri as well, but it's hard to find him because they usually give him his name when he was without a wife, which, by the way, he's one of the proofs that I use that back in the day, a lot of people who came from Arabia would convert and become Egyptian, so they'll get the last name al-Misri after they've moved into Egypt, and that's only one of them. There's some who would move from Alabas, so they'd move from Spain and then move into Africa, and their names would change into these African places. Conventional Sufi sources tend to depict Dhu'l Nun as a pious Muslim and a Sufi Gnostic. A complement is afforded by the report of the history Masudi, the Herodotus of the Arabs. Born in Baghdad, Masudi traveled for many years before settling in Egypt at Fustat. His extensive Muja el-Dahab provides the first extant semi-historical account of Dhu'l Nun, deriving information from inhabitants of Akhmim during a visit made by the historian to the township. Masudi wrote, Dhu'l Nun al-Misri Akhmimi, the eccentric was a philosopher who pursued a course of his own in religion. He was one of those who elucidate the history of these temple ruins. Barabi, he roamed among them and examined a great quantity of figures and inscriptions. Masudi offered a version of some inscriptions which Dhu'l Nun claimed to have deciphered. This report confirms the early fame of the subject as a hieroglyphicist. Modern scholars are inclined to be incredulous of the 9th century archaeology. Dhu'l Nun is said to have discovered a book in the temple of Akhmim. Masudi quotes two saying and a poem allegedly derived from this book. Dr. Epstein has pointed out the lack of any mystical and alchemical meaning in these quotations. Their attributions to Dhu'l Nun seems to be spurious in other sources. These two sayings and the aforementioned poem are ascribed to figures other than Dhu'l Nun. The same analyst concludes that the Masudi lore seems to have originated in Egyptian alchemical circles active in the first half of the 10th century, which may mean 2 generations after Dhu'l Nun. Again, I don't want to give you the impression that he was the only black scholar in Egypt. There was a lot of them, and there was a lot of them who were called Misri, and there was a lot of them who were called with the Nubian name, and then there were others that were called with Zanj and other stuff like that. Now, why in Egypt would this happen? And again, I've said it before, in the golden age of Islam, this was the typical thing that was happening. But let's go somewhere south of the golden age of Islam, because okay, so this was happening, everybody was liking what was happening in this region of the world, but this region of the world was curious about other parts of the world, like they mentioned Zanj regions. This map depicts the Indian Ocean trade routes that might have made the Indonesians move from Indonesia into Madagascar, but they don't fully explain why the Bantu people moved into Madagascar. Now, we know that these Indian Ocean routes would have been opened at least by the 8th century because the Arabs were already there by the 8th century. But if we go back just a little, so if we look at Mozambique, about the 3rd century AD, this is 300 years after allegedly Jesus died. 300 years after he died, we find some porcelain from the Persian Empire in Mozambique. This is pretty far down. In the 6th century, we find even more, a lot there, in a place called Bazaruto Island. Now, this wouldn't be shocking if we didn't know the maps that were being built back then. And the maps by Al-Idrisi, one of the map makers, the supreme map makers of the time, who included every famous city known to man, he only ended at the Horn of Africa. He didn't go lower than that. And maybe even Kilwa is in there, but he didn't go any further down than that. But we know that Persian porcelain made it all the way down to Mozambique. So what's going on here? Well, the answer is in two parts. One, people from the Horn of Africa are probably bringing in stuff down, but we know that there were ships leaving the shores of a place called Chibwene. Chibwene is a location in Mozambique that was connecting two places inside Africa that existed a little later than they did. It connected a place called Manyigeni and Great Zimbabwe, but it was there prior to. And this place from 600 AD traded with Arabs, Indians. In fact, I forgot where to find it now, but there is some attesting to Indian books that talk about them moving through the Indian Ocean southwards and then trading there. But what would they trade? What did they possibly have? Well, there's a bunch of stuff that they had, but we know what they got. First, let's talk about what they got. They got glass and some other unglazed pottery and stuff like that. And of course, the porcelain. So if you imagine 600 AD, right? Imagine in your head, that's when like the Islamic Empire is starting. That's when the Romans and all these other people are kind of at their last leg. The country that is now settled and known as Chad used to have giant traveling peoples and tribes known as nomadic people. These people must have been written about a long time ago, but how do you group them? Do you just separate them and say, okay, there's the people of Chad, they're the dark-skinned people, and we leave it at that? Or do we look back at written record and size down where do we put them? We know that Nilotic people had traded with them for at least thousands of years. Bantu people seem to have done the same, though this is not fully known. And then obviously people from West Africa. These people of Chad seem to be what some people call a crossroads between the Sahara and the Sub-Sahara. What's funny is that the 2/3 of the northern part of Chad are part of the Sahara, defeating this idea that people can't live in the Sahara. The southern parts are much more fertile and in fact have breathed a lot of life into the country. But again, if we go back in history, who were they? My estimation is that they are the Garamantes that were written down about. They fit almost completely everything about the Garamantes. They're nomadic, yet static. They have a lot of treasures and ancient civilizations that go back to that date. And then, of course, there's the writings by the Romans that say that the civilization of the Garamantes starts in Libya and goes all the way to Ethiopia, meaning it starts from North Africa and goes through that area of Chad and ends up by Ethiopia. And in fact, we remember there was that great saying, or the great line in one of the ancient Roman books that said, the Garamantes are no different than the Ethiopians. And who else is no different than the Ethiopians and the people of Chad? In order to answer this question, we have to go back, way back, before the Jesus, before the invasion of the Muslims, before everything else, and go way, way back to about 600 BC, 200 years before Herodotus would make his way into Egypt. Is there any proof of a civilization in Chad at this time? And is there any proof of a civilization having nomadic tendencies? Well, it turns out there is. The Sao culture dates back from 600 BC and was a partially nomadic, partially stationary civilization that had walls. It had iron, copper, bronze, and all other traits that are similar to other African kingdoms. A lot of the things that they did are so similar to other African kingdoms that it's not even funny. But one catch: they spoke an Afroasiatic language. They spoke the Chadic languages. It's easy to say Chadic languages, but these are West Chadic languages, which are Afroasiatic in nature, and these are East Chadic languages, which are Afroasiatic in nature. And these aren't even all of them. This is just the two that I'm going to show for now. So we go back to the Garamantes, and Tacitus tells us that the Garamantes were so organized that at one point, when they did something wrong to Rome, they sent emissaries to Rome in order to issue an apology to the Romans. And so we're not talking about a people here who are kind of loose and crazy and out of their mind. We're talking about a real civilization which has run into another great civilization, the Roman Empire. So we're talking about two people who run into each other who are great. So let's read what it says. For with a smaller army he had succeeded in taking important prisoners, in killing the enemy's commander, and in earning the credit for having brought the war to a conclusion. On his arrival he was attended by envoys of the Garamantes, who had rarely been seen in Rome. Pause. Rarely been seen in Rome. In other words, these people are not like the other people who you could call Levantines, who they might be more rare, but they did go to Rome more often than the Garamantes. These people rarely made their way to Rome. Terrified by the death of Tacfarinas, which I think was a leader of the enemy group, Berbers, and by the consciousness of their own guilt, the Garamantes had sent them to make amends to the Roman people. So let me make sure I'm not mixing up timelines here for you. The whole Roman thing happened in AD, so that one is far away from Herodotus. But let's look at this map for 1 second. You can see here in this map where it actually sizes down everything almost beautifully, especially at that time, in that Roman Empire time. So over here you've got Egypt and Gaetoli, you've got all these places that are in fact Roman, right? Then under them you've got the Garamantes, which are outside of the Roman Empire. If you go lower, you've got the Chadic people, which I would argue the Garamantes are a Chadic people. You can see they're just above, which, by the way, the Chadic people go way up higher than where the words are. Then you go down, you got the northwestern Bantu, and then you've got the eastern Bantu, you got the Nilotic people, Kush, Aksum, the Kushite people of the Horn, the Mande in West Africa, and of course, Atlantic peoples. This is what I would call a very good map. Of course, you got the Nabateans in close to Africa, and then you've got the Parthian Empire going that way. This is I like this. I actually want to start comparing these Central African languages to each other in a deeper way than I have before. So, for example, I want to compare Arabic to the Bantu languages because they seem to have something in common with each other that even the other Afroasiatic languages don't have with each other. But the only way to do this is if I have fully established to you guys that the Afroasiatic languages are in the same region as all the other languages that I wanted to talk to you about. And of course, like I said, there's an evidence here that is so simple. It's the Afroasiatic Chadic version of the language. Right there. Chadic version of the Afroasiatic language. Not only that, they come with everything else that all the Central African, West African, Southern Central African Bantus and Nilotic people come with, which is the face masks, the cuttings, the face cuttings, the iron smelting, which by the way, that more represents Chadic and Bantu and West African early, and then later moves to the other places. But early on, these are the people who are represented by iron smelting very early. Some of the earliest dates are hypothesized to 3000 BC, which would make it very old indeed, because the Iron Age is about 1200 BC, that kind of date, the Iron Age outside of Africa. So I want to make sure that I've established that. But once I've established that to you guys, it's going to be a cakewalk to convince you that the Arabic language is related to like Bantu and thingy languages, which some people, because I did do this comparison in the beginning, but some people, they look at it like it's this radical difference because they live in an imaginary universe that TV and stuff like that has put into their head, that locations, depending how far it is, have nothing to do with each other. Languages have nothing to do with each other.